Deleuze as a theorist of power. Introduction. In the current controversial and intense debates on theories of power, Deleuze is something of a foreign body. He denies easy access. He denies it because he does not fit the usual coordinates and because he asserts apparently contradictory things. As a structuralist, he pleads for a generalized anti-Hegelianism and thus meets expectations which deem to recognize in structuralism a position that is fundamentally dissociated from dialectical thought and from the category of subjectivity used by it. On the other hand, as a theorist of capitalism, who describes the dynamics of the global economy in terms of processes of de- and re-territorialization, he does not only offer linking points for post-Marxist discourses, but also works against the Marxist background in his own theorizing. He agrees with Foucault that, in contrast to the prevailing views of the theoretical tradition, power is not to be regarded as unproductive and merely negating or limiting, as a prohibition or limitation of the freedom to act, and neither as an individually or institutionally manageable resource to bring about effects, for example, to enforce or to thwart actions. However, despite his closeness to Foucault, he considers it necessary to relate the concept of resistance to that of power in a different way. At one point, he writes that he does not want to forego considering effects of repression, and it is well known that he clearly distinguishes what he calls control societies from disciplinary societies, while Foucault does not seem to draw much of a distinction between surveiller and contrôler. The list of equivocations could easily be extended. In order to end it for the time being and to take a step forward, it is worth recalling that Deleuze makes a suggestion to reformulate Foucault's concept of the dispositive. In his reading, the dispositive is transformed into an agencement, that is, a composition or compilation which, as ordered, is at the same time an ordering, even if without the guarantee of some sort of stability, however constituted. A kind of agency that collects and mediates by creating conditions for actions as well as things, for the visible as well as the sayable. In English, the term is translated as assemblage, in German mostly as Gefüge. In the present context, it can also simply be rendered as power or power relation. With regard to Foucault, the conceptual shifts to be observed here are quite similar to those in the case of genealogy, insofar as it is understood as a method of investigating power relations. In both cases, the conceptual shifts can be reconstructed by addressing the underlying character of the immanence of power. Immanence, I suggest, is conceived quite differently by Foucault and Deleuze. If Deleuze is to be invoked as a theorist of power, one is bound to elucidate his understanding of power as immanence. This, in turn, makes it necessary to recapitulate his reading of the philosophical positions which have shaped his own conception of the subject, Nietzsche and Foucault. First part, power as immanence. In contrast to Foucault, the concept of immanence in Deleuze can be used to describe his philosophy as a whole. Already in his books on Nietzsche, 1962, the demand is made to realize with Nietzsche a critique that goes beyond the Kantian critique. This philosophically radical critique is conceived as an immanent critique, which generalizes the immanent use of reason in the Kantian sense, yet also turned against Kant. Essentially, Deleuze's aim here is not only to relate the ideas of reason in the field of theoretical philosophy according to Kant to experience, but to reject the metaphysical foundation of structures a priori, which in turn, against Kant, transcend experience. It is even possible to rediscover this thought in schematic form in his study on Hume from 1953, where empiricist immanence is played off against the consolidation of fixed structures of transcendental subjectivity. This is important in that the term philosophy of immanence rightly refers to an empiricism which claims a new radicality for itself around 1900, not only in Nietzsche and representatives of a philosophical psychology, but also in the context of pragmatism and imperiocriticism. These early references notwithstanding, it is only the book on Spinoza from 1968 that first marks the definitive key position of the concept of immanence. With Spinoza, immanence moves to the center of Deleuzian philosophy, and there it remains up to the very last texts, together with the high appreciation for Spinoza, or better, with the systematic weight of the philosophical endeavor of his ethics. The Spinozist principle of immanence is at the center of the ontology of univocity, which Deleuze unfolds in the first chapter of Difference in Repetition. And in What is Philosophy, published in 1991 and co-authored with Félix Guattari, immanence denotes a philosophical plane of thought, an indispensable orientation in thought, or a modern, no longer morally, metaphysically stylized image of thought, which, de jure or by rights, excludes the illusions of transcendence. All conceptual thinking presupposes immanence and can therefore be analyzed genealogically. I quote Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy? We will say that the plane of immanence is, at the same time, that which must be thought and that which cannot be thought. It is the non-thought within thought. It is the base of all planes, immanent to every thinkable plane that does not succeed in thinking it. It is the most intimate within thought and yet the absolute outside. End of quote. And if there was a philosopher who understood, quote, that immanence was only immanent to itself, end of quote, then it was Spinoza. And another quote from the same book, perhaps he is the only philosopher, Spinoza, perhaps he is the only philosopher never to have compromised with transcendence and to have hunted it down everywhere. Spinoza is the vertigo of immanence from which so many philosophers try in vain to escape. Will we ever be mature enough for a Spinozist inspiration? End of quote. The use Deleuze makes of Spinoza revolves around an ontologically conceived difference, a difference which declares itself from the being itself by referring philosophically to temporally, spatially, and otherwise determined processes of becoming, which cannot be grounded in fixed identities. A difference in which being or blocks of being splinter, which makes it possible to think relations of immanence. Herein lies one motive for the philosophical relevance of Deleuze and the frequently expressed view that the ontology sought after today, an ontology of processes, nature, or life, of modes of existence and collectives, of a new realism and a new metaphysics, is most likely to find in his ontology of difference. However, one must be careful not to confuse the differential ontology of processes with a romanticism of indeterminacy. If it therefore seems natural, in the sense of an antidote, to define immanence as power. This approach is supported by the sources that Deleuze names foremost, Spinoza and Nietzsche. After all, the concept of the will to power is one that Deleuze employs for the development of his ontology. And in Spinoza, too, power, understood as potentia agendi, must be conceived as an immanent process which affirms and amplifies itself. I will return to these aspects in a moment, but before, an obvious problem has to be pointed out. A problem that, it seems, Deleuze shares with Foucault. After all, power and counterpower, power and resistance, or put differently, representation and difference are not the same. Or are they? Is the dark power not confronted by another, whereby it, the tacit agreement with it, can be fought? From my point of view, these questions are not easy to answer. They rather require complicated answers. And although Deleuze and Foucault share this problem, they answer it in different ways, with different accentuations. The theory of power, which Foucault outlines in The Will to Knowledge, meets the demand placed upon it to conceive power as a productive force. Power is understood as a complex formation of differential relations that produce identities, forms of individualizations, orders of the visible and the sayable, strategies for the regulation of a politically manageable life of populations. This is, in other words, a dispositive, which on the one hand exhibits the moving substrate of force relations, quote, Foucault, which by virtue of their inequality constantly engender states of power, but the latter are always local and unstable, end of quote, and which on the other hand consolidates the representations of power that results from their strategies. They form in their entirety the unity of the dispositive. Their, I quote, general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the social hegemonies. One might say that power comprises at least three things. First, differential micro-relations. Second, strategies of specific forms of actualization. And thirdly, actualities as concentrations of power that consolidate social hierarchies. Foucault focuses on the two last points. With Deleuze, on the other hand, there is at first a strong tendency to concentrate on points 1 and 3 and to contrast them, difference versus representation, immanence versus transcendence. At the same time, however, he also keeps the connecting dimension in view, and he discusses it in terms of processes of actualization and repetition. But he does not do so with regards to a theory of power. It is only in 1,000 Plateaus, in reaction to Foucault's deliberations, that he and Guattari take up the notion of power processes as productive actualizations, which occur in a differential milieu and which nevertheless have fatal consequences. Here, the distinction becomes important that, with Deleuze, one can also make between power and immanence. Immanence, which is only immanent to itself, or which corresponds to a purely differential ontology, may be thought as power in the sense of power one. But it will not create conditions that, in the sense of a strategically directed unification of the differential, cement power blocks in the sense of power three. In other words, nomadology is not subject to any dispositive in the Foucauldian sense, whereas sovereignty-bound state thinking, or the juridical representations of power, that is, of the modern power of discipline and of life, is. When Deleuze accuses Foucault of marginalizing resistance, Foucault can reply that he hypostasizes resistance along with the lines of flight of immanence. This just about summarizes the state of their discussions in the second half of the 1970s. While Foucault analyzes the productivity of power, in order to extract the dispositive of sexuality along with the discourses of truth and freedom that are connected with it, Deleuze accentuated micropolitics and the processes of becoming minoritarian, that is, practical forms of resistance that coexist with the thinking of the immanence of power, and connected with this, with a critique of its forms of representation geared towards transcendence. In the inability of representation to think its own emergence, the Foucauldian idea is reflected that the power in the dispositive ensures that it has secrets, and at the same time installs the imperative to lift them, to recognize the truth, to finally be free. Yet the secret is nothing other than the misconceived productivity of power itself, or put differently, its aged ignorance. In the will to knowledge, truth functions as meaning and as something desirable with nihilistic qualities because it helps to maintain a striving for power that, in contrast to its aims and ideals, or in contrast to the juridical representation, cannot affirm itself. Come to the second part, will to power, Nietzsche. In the chapter on subjectivation, on the book on Foucault from 1986, analogous to the new discussions of the technologies of the self and the relations of the self to itself of the ancient Greeks, conducted by Foucault, starting with the second volume of his History of Sexuality, Deleuze adds another dimension to the forms of knowledge and power discussed so far. This is a dimension concerning the self-referentiality of power, or a folding of forces which in their movement break from the strict codes. By no means does it assume the ontological function of establishing a natural correspondence between the visible and the sayable. Rather, it interrupts the by nature subject logical mediation, creates a milieu of pragmatic relations, and at the same time escapes the framework of its regular assignment. With this consideration, Deleuze combines the aspect of subjectivation with an extension of the Foucauldian theory of power, insofar as he focuses on its points of deterritorialization, which is power one, makes these coextensive with the primacy of immanence and resistance, and separates them from the diagrams, power two, that form current social hierarchies and monopolies of governance, which is power three. The self-referentiality of power, in turn, is explained with recourse to Nietzsche. I quote, Deleuze, it was necessary to recover force in the Nietzschean sense, or power in the very particular sense of will to power, end of quote. According to Deleuze, this force exhibits the self-referentiality which can be developed from the immanence of power, which is power one. With it, the focus of the notion of immanence no longer lies in a specific mode of reference between power and knowledge, or in their reciprocal implication, but is shifted into an area which is independent of the orders of knowledge and power. As early as at the beginning of the 1960s, Deleuze had described the will to power as a genealogical element of force, or as power's principle of the synthesis. Genealogical means both differential and genetic, in the sense of an immanent production of empirical, or as Deleuze says, differentiated and qualified conditions. Thus, the will to power functions as an internal element of production, insofar as differential differences of quantity generate empirical qualities their own accord. From Deleuze's point of view, it is firstly possible with Nietzsche to determine power immanently or genealogically by referring it to the will to power. Secondly, the phenomena of the denial of the will and the becoming reactive of forces connected with it can be reconstructed. And thirdly, it can be shown that there is a link between nihilism and representation, which is substantial for the theory of power. By will to power, Nietzsche does not mean a striving for power in the sense of having power. In a paradoxical formulation, Deleuze maintains that the will to power, in any case, does not want the power. It is neither the goal nor the motive of the will's desire. If it were, then power could be identified with an object of representation, in the sense of power 3. In this way, its immanent determination and the possibility of a genealogical investigation of representative standards of validity would likewise be given up. According to Deleuze, precisely this is the case whenever power is reduced to the recognition or the enforcement of domination. Quote Deleuze from Nietzsche and Philosophy, "The famous dialectical aspect of the master-slave relationship depends on the fact that power is conceived not as will to power, but as representation of power, representation of superiority, recognition by the one of the superiority of the other." End of quote. Similarly, Heidegger, in his interpretation, misunderstood the genealogical principle of the will to power, since he believed to recognize in it a figure of unfettered subjectivity which carries representative thinking to extremes. By contrast, what is crucial for Deleuze is Nietzsche's notion that power, which for structural reasons cannot develop an affirmative relationship to the will actualizing itself in it, is not good but rather bad, and this regardless of its potential broad effectiveness. It is bad because and insofar as it is nihilist in itself and collaborates with discursive identities which in their systematic determination exclude its genealogy. That means, in other words, that it transcends the frame of validity, of its perspectivity and finiteness, the earthly and transient, affective and contingent events in the metaphysical search for certainty. So what is the relevance of Nietzsche's thinking on power? It opens up a genealogical or novel power analytical perspective by immanently making comprehensible what concrete strategies and operations are at work when ideas of a higher power are institutionalized. The focus of his analysis is on topics pertaining to the critique of metaphysics, morality, and religion. For example, feelings of guilt, bad conscience, ressentiment, will to truth, ascetic ideals. One of the most important analytical hypotheses is that the ideas of a higher power are incompatible with the concrete strategies and operations which have historically produced them. Or more precisely, that these ideas and beliefs are of a nihilistic type, insofar as they are threatened by the description of their own genesis and at the core can even be destroyed by it. In its logic, this procedure corresponds to Foucault's unmasking of the juridical representation of power. Through the demonstration of the productive power relations of the disciplining of the body in the prison, the barracks, and educational institutions, and the regulation of life in medicine, psychiatry, social statistics, and demographic policy, the discursive self-conception of power, which is focused on sovereign authority, collapses. But in what way can Deleuze now bring into play the concept of the will to power in order to extend the analysis of power beyond the critical dimension of genealogy? From my point of view, one option lies in further insisting on immanence, an immanence with which power in the sense of power one fuses, and this makes it necessary to speak of Spinoza at the end. Third part, agency, Spinoza. The focus of ethics is on the problem of becoming active or of increasing the capacity to act in the sense of a power of action, potentia agendi. The good and the pure positivity, which is rooted in the active self-affirmation of the essential mode of existence, in the desire of pleasure and the pleasure of desire, are intertwined with this power. Apparently, Deleuze connects this power with the immanent causality of an adequate cause of this action. That is, to realize and to be able to realize that the affects have an activating or pleasure-producing effect. And this presupposes that bodies which affect and are affected by each other jointly increase their capacity to act and can find adequate common concepts only in this congruence. Whereas there's a reduction of the capacity to act wherever it is inhibited by the advent of passive affects or suffering. With passivity, there appears an external power which separates the existing modes from what they are capable of doing. This powerlessness possesses no positivity, in the sense that it expresses only an incapability, a power of negation. With it, the productivity of power is eliminated by preventing the existing modes from associating and from experiencing in their relationships the increasing of their power to affect and to be affected, and thus also to act and to think. This process of increasing power is neither to be reduced to individuals nor to their selfish interests. Rather, it asserts its immanent character by coming from below and by being effective in all social relations that contribute to the benefit and well-being, but not to the harm and detriment of the involved parties. There may be particular difficulties in dealing with the ethical criterion of Spinoza, which is increase or diminution of the power to act. But adherence to transcendent crutches remains an indication of dogmatic preconceptions that obscure the contingent, precarious and open process of political association through anthropomorphisms, teleological assumptions, or truths of faith that consolidate hierarchical social structures. With this minimal sketch of the Spinozist understanding of power, the distinction between Foucault and Deleuze, which was anticipated at the beginning, can be made still clearer. Deleuze distinguishes himself as an immanence philosophical theorist of power, not only by conceiving with Nietzsche the will to power as a pluralistic concept of the differential, micro-physical processes of power in the sense of power one, but also with Spinoza by dealing with the process of becoming democratic, which in its radicality remains immanent to itself and therefore cannot be translated into the text of discipline and control together with their discursive representations. Power comes from below because, with Foucault, it does not come from above. Its productive unfolding demands the king's head, in theory too. But it also comes from below because, with Spinoza, it cannot be reduced to strategies that train the individual body and politically and economically administer the life of the population. It is a power of practice or of micro-practice which undermines the great dispositives and assemblages, even though it itself produces associations and connections. However, these are of a different type because their rules of connection permit heterogeneous concatenations and sabotage the schematic unification of singular constellations. In this sense, one can say that Deleuze succeeds in productively taking up the objections to Foucault's theory of power, which were submitted by the theorists of practice. like Michel de Certeau. With regard to Latour's objections, it can be said that knowledge of power relations is not elitist knowledge, provided that power is always also described analytically, critically, not behind collective fields of action, but in the midst of them. As is well known, with the concept of micropolitics, Guattari and Deleuze built on the microsociology of Tarde. It's therefore not surprising that, like Latour in his Sociology of Associations, which also draws on Tarde, they describe and compile small assemblages of micro-practices which defy the established orders of representation, because they put things in relation that do not correspond to the canonical lists of serious actors or to stable system boundaries. In contrast to Latour, however, they hold on to the use of the concept of power. This arguably makes sense mainly because their assemblages or agencements at the same time integrate all dimensions of power. That is, run to and from between the virtual and the actual determinations. They are hybrid constellations of discursive and non-discursive practices which link lines of de- and re-territorialization. Otherwise, it is difficult to imagine how power relations might imminently be criticized. For this, it must be possible to move within power and to take into account the operations of its current formation, the schemata of the dominating cultural identities, and the guidelines of normalization. In this sense, with Spinoza, micropolitics opens up, which is related to the presence of representation and can set off from it processes of becoming other. Deleuze and Guattari have developed the concept of becoming minoritarian for this process. As in the case of becoming other, the processes of becoming minoritarian are also characterized by the fact that they expose the involved group identities to mutual changes. They are, as it were, critical practices that intervene in hierarchical power relations by strengthening the immanent processes. How is that possible? A becoming minoritarian always happens when a majority, which acts as a representative standard, is disturbed. The majority is here not to be misunderstood as a numerical quantity. Rather, it is defined as a human, cultural, economic norm. Male, white, adult, rational, healthy, and we could add heterosexual, Christian, employed, productive, flexible, functional, informed, well-dressed, and well-proportioned. Its standards not only define goals of normalization, they can also be abandoned or changed. While minorities, like majorities, can be regarded as fixed identities, becoming minoritarian refers to a development that triggers transformation processes in both directions, in relation to the majority and at the same time to the minority. In this context, Deleuze and Guattari speak of a block of becoming, or of a double movement. I quote, one by which a term, the subject, is withdrawn from the majority, and another by which a term, the medium or agent, rises up from the minority. End of quote. Becoming Jewish, becoming woman, becoming animal, becoming invisible. In all these cases, standards of the distinguished identity of being human, which embody the asymmetrical power relations, are abandoned by at the same time breaching the definition of the minority as minority. A quote from Thousand Plateaus, as Faulkner said, to avoid ending up a fascist, there was no other choice but to become black. End of quote. A minority loses its identity of an inferior existence defined in a majoritarian way only by itself becoming minoritarian, that is, by undermining the hierarchical distribution of power along with its discursive and institutional support. It is a question of becoming. Becoming minoritarian brings forth associations which result from a reciprocal transformation of the majoritarian-minoritarian identities, so that an increase of the joint agency in the sense of power one is achieved, and this automatically at the expense of a power of representation in the sense of power three, which can only become effective in the reduction of the collective capacity to act. This is not a utopia, but the reality of a variety of everyday practices which here and there merge into small social movements. If it is true that the crisis of discipline described by Deleuze has long since arisen, and that the present situation has produced new power mechanisms of control, then this diagnosis does not alter the fact that there are immanently determined forms of resistance and power, in the sense of power one, in becoming minoritarian. According to Deleuze, the regime of control too must be one that emerges from below by establishing, through the use of novel strategies, power two, living conditions, which in turn are based on discursive representations, power three. It is easily possible to distinguish the three dimensions of power, even if they transform in their concrete manifestations. With the term control, Deleuze aims at the virtual real modeling of conditions of action, the mechanisms of which are problematic, where they integrate blockades into the relations of immanence and curtail possibilities of association. Controlled, authorized identities result from selective processes or filtration systems, and as always, there is a remainder which, due to its non-representation, must contain minoritarian determinations. They contain the potentials of becoming, which, however, can only unfold in a process of change involving both sides, the majority and the minority.